The next speaker is Rola El-Husseini Dean, and she's an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and also at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She has a background from the US, Yale University, and also at Texas A&M University and New York University. A book published on Pax Syriana, on post-war Lebanon, and you have also published widely on Lebanese Hezbollah, on Arab Shiism, and Iran. And you are, as far as I know, also working on a very topical book on political representation of women in the Middle East after the Arab uprising. And you will now give your Trendspotting here, an analysis on authoritarian restoration and state failure. So the floor is yours, Rola.
Thank you. Yes, okay, it's working. So, good afternoon, everyone. I see some of my students in here, and they will be surprised to see a PowerPoint, because I never do that in class. But it's to help me keep the time. So, what are the patterns in the Middle East and North Africa region after the Arab Spring? We have had over a decade since then, and what are the consequences? We call this wave, this social movement, I'm calling it here Arab Spring 1.0. And the end results so far are authoritarian restoration in Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, and state failure in places like Libya and Yemen. We also see a lot of monarchical resistance and resilience. The monarchies are still there. We see cosmetic reforms, but these cosmetic reforms might be leading to authoritarian upgrading. We have had a second wave of movements in the region, what I'm calling here Arab Spring 2.0, Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, and Lebanon. And what can we predict about the future of the MENA region? Now, this is my caveat here. We cannot predict. I hate to predict. Because as you see, the MENA scholars have failed to predict all these events. However, we can see patterns and trends, and this is what I want to talk about. So these are the three trends that I was able to kind of figure out in the region. I'm seeing authoritarian backsliding or authoritarian restorations in a place like Egypt and maybe in Tunisia. We're seeing civil wars and conflict in the region with two possible consequences, either a return to the status quo ante, and therefore authoritarian restoration, for example, Syria, or state failure, Libya and Yemen. And we see monarchical resilience. All 8 monarchies in the region have survived the Arab uprisings. Many have experienced unrest. We'll talk more about that later. But that has not led to the removal of any of the kings in the region. So let me start with the example, the best example of authoritarian restoration, and that's Egypt. As you know, there was a coup led by General Abdel Fattah Sisi in July 2013 against the elected president at the time. He was elected President of Egypt in 2014, then re-elected in 2018. And you can see domestic repression, devaluation of the currency, mega projects in Egypt. We don't know where the money is coming from. But he still remains a close US ally despite allegations of torture, extrajudicial executions, etc. Sisi has led to some constitutional amendments in 2019, which extended his presidential limits. And now he can be president at least until 2030, maybe another president for life. So we are seeing in Egypt more of an authoritarian regime than under Mubarak, and actually less freedom than under Mubarak, definitely less freedom of speech. Tunisia was the success story of the Arab Spring, and we saw that success story souring. It was a success story until the election of Qais Said in October 2019, and we see him doing a series of political movements let's call them, declaring a state of emergency, presidential order granting himself extra powers, removing parliament. And then in October, he appoints the first female prime minister of the region. What does that mean? Why? Is that a sign of something positive, or is it just performative? I would argue it's performative. Thousands of Tunisians have protested these measures by Said, but he also has a lot of popular support. And he can encourage his supporters to go to the streets and protest. Is that a slippery slope to violence and civil war in Tunisia? Is that the future of Tunisia? So this is Kais Said and the new female prime minister, both professors, he of constitutional law and she of geology, both of them no experience in politics. Syria, we have civil war and then a return to what I call the status quo ante. So we know that the Assad regime survived the uprising and the civil war with the help of Iran and Russia. Anti-regime protesters are dead, in exile, or in prison. And we know that there is a humanitarian catastrophe. Some of my colleagues have alluded to it with migration from Syria. Today, the regime has regained control over almost the entirety of the territory, and the international community, the Arab neighbors, are trying to bring Assad back from the cold into the Arab League and other institutions. So basically, Assad has won. The question is Hafiz al-Assad Jr. the future of Syria? And here you have Assad's father and Assad's son. So is Assad's son the next president of Syria? Yemen, state failure there. Yemen deposed its former president for life after the uprisings in 2011. They had UN-sponsored national dialogue. They could not agree on a constitution. And eventually, we end up with civil war, with the Houthis on one side, supported by Iran, and the government of Yemen, supported by Saudi Arabia. We know that there is a support for a US-led coalition, a Saudi-led coalition, supported by the US, France, Germany, and the UK. And this is all basically has become a sort of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We know that there is a humanitarian crisis. More than 3/4 of the population lacks access to drinking water and sanitation. We have cholera cases. 80% of Yemenis under 18 face threats to their health, and children are facing acute malnutrition. Here are some pictures of Yemen. So monarchical resilience is the third trend. All the Arab monarchies survived, both what we call traditional monarchies, Jordan and Morocco, and the rentier monarchies of the Gulf. Both types of monarchies have used a mix of pro forma reforms, repression, and incentives. So their political concessions, their so-called reform, include giving women more rights, a new constitution, some new liberties. Morocco, however, suppressed, for example, the Hirak movement in the Rif, and we know that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia suppressed the movement in the eastern province, eventually killing Shia religious leaders. We know also that they gave monetary incentives to the population. Here you have some numbers of cash that families or individuals in these rentier states have received from the government, basically to keep the population quiescent. So the question here is, we know that there was a failure of the first wave of the Arab uprising. What about the second wave that I mentioned? Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan, and Algeria. Now, the first observation we have is that all these countries are post-conflict. They have all emerged from some kind of civil war. But we also know that the protests have fizzled in these countries, more or less because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question is here, what is the future of these countries? I would argue that what we're seeing in Algeria and Sudan is a military takeover with authoritarian consolidation, basically following the Egypt model. And what we're seeing in Iraq and Lebanon is basically state failure, more or less following the Yemen model. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.